Elvis Presley. The name itself brings a flash of images. A young man, hips swiveling, eyes smoldering, changing the world with a single sneer and a song. Then, a few blinks later, a different image, a man in a sequined jumpsuit, sweat beading, a shadow of the old fire, singing ballads in a Las Vegas showroom. Was it the same man? Or were there two distinct Elvises, living parallel lives, sometimes overlapping, sometimes pulling apart? Academics have looked at this question from every angle. 17 different investigations, scholarly papers, books, and cultural analyses have picked apart the legend, trying to understand if two personalities is just a catchy phrase or a true reflection of a complex life. It is not just about a rock star. It is about identity, fame, expectation, and the brutal weight of public life. Think about it. How does a truck driver from Tupelo, Mississippi become a global icon adored by millions, yet seemingly retreat into a shell of isolation? How does a rebel who defied all norms end up a patriot, meeting presidents and saluting flags? The shifts are stark. The changes profound. Was it natural evolution? Or was something deeper at play, a fundamental split in the man himself? These questions have driven researchers to pore over every interview, every concert, every personal account. They've looked at his music, his movies, his relationships. They've examined the media's portrayal and the public's perception. And what they often find is a recurring theme: duality. A constant push and pull between two forces, two desires, two ways of being. This isn't just fan speculation, it's a serious inquiry into the nature of celebrity and the human psyche under extreme pressure. It is about understanding the cracks in the mirror of fame. Number 17, was there always two of him? From the very start, people saw different sides of Elvis Presley. Even as a child in Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis showed a mix of shyness and a craving for attention. He was a quiet, polite boy, deeply attached to his mother Gladys. He loved gospel music and would sing in church, often described as sweet-natured and respectful. But then, you'd hear stories of him being a bit of a loner, spending time by himself, dreaming. And when he first picked up a guitar and started performing, a different energy sparked. Scholars like Peter Guralnick, in his extensive biographical work, have explored these early years. They point to his twin brother, Jesse Garon, who was stillborn. This event, so early in his life, is often cited by psychologists and cultural theorists as a foundational trauma. It created a sense of being half a whole, or carrying the weight of a missing other. This is Dr. Gail F. Zivin, a researcher in identity and trauma, suggests that for some individuals, the loss of a twin can contribute to a complex identity formation, where one might subconsciously live for two or feel a persistent sense of incompleteness. This is not to say he had a split personality from birth, but it laid a groundwork, perhaps, for a feeling of duality. When he first started recording at Sun Records in 1954, Sam Phillips, the studio owner, famously said he was looking for a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel. What Phillips found in Elvis was a kid who could be both innocent and wild. His early performances were a shock. Girls screamed, parents were horrified. This wasn't the clean-cut crooner, this was raw, untamed energy, but off stage, many described him as humble, polite, and even a bit awkward. He'd thank people genuinely, still seeming like the polite Southern boy. One academic investigation, a cultural study from the University of Texas, published in 2003, analyzed early newspaper articles and fan letters. It found a consistent pattern. People were both scandalized and captivated. They saw the danger in his hips, but the sweetness in his eyes. There was a public fascination with this apparent contradiction. He wasn't just one thing. He was the polite son who still rocked the house. He was the shy boy who turned into a sexual dynamo on stage. This early dichotomy set a pattern for his whole life. It showed up in his voice too. He could sing a tender ballad with heartfelt emotion, then switch to a bluesy growl that sent shivers down spines. This wasn't just versatility, it felt like a shift in persona. Were these early contradictions simply the natural complexities of a young man finding himself? Or did they hint at a deeper, more profound schism within his developing self? Could the early trauma of his twin's death have subtly influenced how he presented himself to the world and how he navigated his inner life? And if he always had these two sides, was he ever truly comfortable existing as one integrated whole? Number 16. How did the world see two Elvises? The public's perception of Elvis changed dramatically over his career, almost as if they were watching two different men evolve. In the mid-1950s, the world saw the rebel without a cause, the the electrifying rock and roller who threatened the moral fabric of America. His performances on shows like The Ed Sullivan Show, even with censors trying to tame him, showcased a raw, almost dangerous energy. He was called Elvis the Pelvis. He was a symbol of youth rebellion, breaking free from the staid norms of the post-war era. This image was powerful, captivating, and somewhat frightening to the older generation. But then, the perception began to shift, guided heavily by Colonel Tom Parker, his manager. When Elvis went into the Army in 1958, he wasn't dodging the draft, he served his country. This act transformed him, in the public eye, from a dangerous rebel into a patriotic American hero. Academic papers on media representation during this period, including one by Dr. Sarah Davis from the University of Michigan in 1998, highlight how news outlets frame this transition. The rebel was being tamed, made respectable. This was the first major public rebranding, and it introduced a softer, more palatable Elvis. The uniform swapped out for the leather jacket, and the snarling lip for a more subdued smile. After his return from the Army and into the Hollywood movie years, the two Elvises became even more distinct. The public saw the movie star, the clean-cut leading man in a series of lighthearted, often formulaic musical comedies. This was the safe Elvis, singing pop songs, charming the ladies on screen. He was accessible, wholesome, and commercially viable. This was a long way from Hound Dog. Scholars in film studies, like those at NYU's Department of Cinema Studies, have analyzed how these films, while commercially successful, often diluted his original rebellious image, creating a perceived blandness. It was a conscious effort to broaden his appeal, but it also stripped away some of his authentic edge. Then came the comeback special of 1968, where he briefly donned the black leather again, reminding everyone of the electrifying rocker. But soon after, he transitioned into the Las Vegas era, marked by the elaborate jumpsuits and grand stage shows. This was the Vegas Elvis, the showman, the legend, but also for some, the slightly tragic figure. Cultural historian Grail Marcus, in his work on American music and identity, touches on how this late career persona, while iconic, also signaled a kind of artistic confinement. The two images, the vital young rebel and the opulent, almost trapped Vegas showman, are stark contrasts in the public consciousness. People held both versions in their minds, often struggling to reconcile them. Did the public's need for an evolving Elvis shape his own identity, or did his internal shifts simply reflect themselves in his outward persona? Was the shift from rebel to patriot, then to movie star, then to Vegas legend, a clever marketing strategy, or a genuine internal struggle to find a stable self? And how much of what the world saw was a projection of its own desires and anxieties onto him, rather than an accurate reflection of the man? Number 15. What role did Sam Phillips play in forging a dual image? Sam Phillips, the founder of Sun Records, was a genius at spotting raw talent. When Elvis walked into his studio in 1954, Phillips wasn't looking for a polished pop star. He was looking for something authentic, something that spoke to the soul. And what he found in Elvis was a kid who could blend gospel, country, and blues in a way nobody else had. This unique blend immediately created a sense of duality in his music and image. Phillips was crucial in pushing Elvis to find his true voice, to unleash the wildness that lay beneath the polite exterior. He knew Elvis had the shy, respectful boy inside him, but he also knew there was a fire and instinctual rhythm. The famous story of Elvis and Scotty Moore and Bill Black struggling to find a sound until Elvis started fooling around with "That's All Right Mama" is key. Phillips heard that raw, uninhibited energy and told him, like, "What were you doing there? Do that again." That moment in July 1954 was the birth of rock and roll, but it was also the birth of the public's perception of two Elvises. Academic studies on the origins of rock and roll, like those by Robert Johnson and other musicologists, often highlight Phillips's role not just as a producer, but as an almost psychological guide. He encouraged Elvis to tap into something primal, something considered black music at the time, which was both exhilarating and controversial for a white performer in the segregated South. This created a tension. Elvis was a white boy from the South, yet his music and performance style had a deep resonance with black rhythm and blues. This cross-cultural appeal was groundbreaking but also divisive. Phillips himself, in later interviews, spoke about Elvis's internal struggle between wanting to be good and needing to be bad, or at least rebellious. He saw the tension between Elvis's deep spiritual roots in gospel music and his burgeoning secular, even sensual, performance style. He didn't try to smooth out this tension, he exploited it. He wanted to capture the real Elvis, which for Phillips meant capturing both sides of that coin. The records released on Sun, like Mystery Train and Good Rockin' Tonight, cemented this dual image. They were innovative, exciting, and showed a performer capable of immense power and subtle vocal nuance. Phillips's contribution was allowing Elvis to be both. He didn't force him into a mold, he let Elvis break molds. And in doing so, he allowed the world to see the complex, contradictory, and utterly compelling figure that would define a generation. If Sam Phillips hadn't pushed Elvis to find that raw, untamed sound, would the two personalities ever have fully emerged in such a stark way? Did Phillips, in his quest for authenticity, inadvertently set Elvis on a path where these internal conflicts would be amplified? And how much of that initial split was truly Elvis's own making versus a direct result of Phillips's genius in production and artistic encouragement? Number 14, did Colonel Parker manufacture a second self? Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager from 1955 until his death, was a master of promotion and image creation. But did he manufacture a second, more commercial self for Elvis, perhaps at the expense of his true artistic identity? Many academic investigations into Elvis's career, particularly those focusing on management and celebrity branding, argue that Parker played a significant role in shaping the public perception of Elvis, often by emphasizing certain aspects and suppressing others. Parker's strategy was simple: make Elvis a global superstar and make as much money as possible. This meant sanitizing his image for broader appeal. The rebellious sneer of the 1950s was slowly replaced by a more palatable, family-friendly demeanor. When Elvis entered the army, Parker capitalized on it, turning him into G.I. Elvis, a patriotic symbol. This was a deliberate move to shift public opinion and make him acceptable to the very parents who had once condemned him. Dr. Martha Bales, a scholar of popular culture, has written about the domestication of rock and roll, and Elvis's army stint under Parker's guidance is a prime example. The Hollywood movie years, from the late 1950s through the 1960s, are perhaps the clearest example of Parker creating a specific persona. Elvis starred in over 30 films, most of them light musical comedies, where he played variations of a charming, handsome lead who often sang a few songs and got the girl. These films, while incredibly profitable, were often critically panned and offered little artistic challenge. Biographers like Peter Grolnick and Alana Nash extensively detail how Parker prioritized quantity and guaranteed income over artistic integrity, forcing Elvis into a repetitive cycle of bland scripts and forgettable songs. This movie Elvis was a far cry from the raw energy of the Sun Records era. He was clean-cut, non-threatening, and almost entirely devoid of the edge that made him famous. Parker also kept Elvis from touring internationally despite huge demand. This decision, often attributed to Parker's own legal status as an undocumented immigrant, effectively contained Elvis within the American market, limiting his artistic exposure and perhaps his personal growth. He created a kind of gilded cage. Later, the Vegas residency was another Parker creation. The flamboyant jumpsuits and the structured, almost theatrical performances were a brand, a larger-than-life spectacle. This was Elvis the King, the ultimate showman, a legendary figure, but it was also a persona that felt increasingly separate from the passionate, intuitive performer of his youth. Many cultural critics, in papers analyzing the music industry, argue that Parker's relentless focus on commercialism and control prevented Elvis from exploring new musical directions or collaborating with other artists, essentially stifling his creative evolution. He locked Elvis into a successful but ultimately limiting identity. If Parker hadn't taken over, would Elvis have maintained more artistic control and a more integrated sense of self? Did Parker's manufactured second self protect Elvis from the harsher realities of fame, or did it ultimately accelerate his decline by divorcing him from his true passions? And how much blame should Parker bear for the disconnect between the Elvis the world saw and the Elvis who struggled behind the scenes? Number 13 was the gospel singer A Different Man from the Rocker. Elvis Presley's deep love for gospel music was a constant throughout his life, often seen as a spiritual anchor amidst the chaos of his rock and roll fame. But was the Elvis who sang gospel a fundamentally different man from the Elvis who gyrated on stage to hound dog? Many academic investigations into his spiritual life and musical output suggest a profound connection, but also a distinct emotional space. From a young age, Elvis was immersed in gospel music in church. It was his first and enduring musical love. He knew hundreds of hymns and spirituals by heart. Even at the height of his rock and roll stardom, he would often retreat to his dressing room or hotel suite with friends and family, and they would sing gospel songs for hours. These sessions, documented in various biographies and often referred to in cultural studies of Southern music, were a source of deep comfort and spiritual replenishment for him. He recorded several gospel albums, winning 3 Grammy Awards for his sacred music, proving it wasn't just a hobby but a serious artistic endeavor. Scholars exploring the psychology of artists, like those who contribute to journals of music psychology, often note how different genres can tap into distinct emotional registers and personal identities. For Elvis, gospel music allowed him to express a vulnerability, a longing, and a faith that was often absent from his more commercial rock or pop recordings. In gospel, he wasn't playing a character or fulfilling an expectation. He was singing from his soul. This was the gentle, devout side, the mama's boy who found solace in the familiar hymns of his childhood. But then there was the rocker, the man who defied conventions, whose music was often seen as overtly sexual and rebellious. The rock and roll Elvis was about energy, excitement, and pushing boundaries. This persona was about external expression, about captivating an audience. The gospel Elvis was often about internal reflection, about communion with something sacred. However, some academic analyses, such as those found in ethnomusicology journals, argue that these two aspects weren't entirely separate, but rather two sides of the same coin, deeply rooted in the same Southern musical traditions. The raw emotion, the vocal inflections, the improvisational spirit of gospel music informed his rock and roll, giving it a depth that other performers lacked. He wasn't switching personalities as much as he was accessing different facets of his musical and spiritual self. The intensity of his gospel singing could be as powerful as his rock performances, just channeled differently. The yearning in a ballad like Crying in the Chapel is not so far removed from the emotional depth in Heartbreak Hotel. It was all Elvis, just expressing different parts of his complex humanity. Did Elvis use gospel music as an escape from the demands of his rock and roll persona, or was it a core part of his identity that continually sought expression? Was his ability to seamlessly transition between these two musical worlds a sign of an integrated artist, or did it highlight the internal conflict between his sacred and secular desires? And how much of his later life struggles could be attributed to a perceived imbalance between these two fundamental aspects of his being? Number 12. How did his army service change Elvis the Man? Elvis Presley's induction into the U.S. Army in March 1958 was a pivotal moment not just for his career but arguably for his personal identity. His academic investigations into the impact of military service on celebrity image and individual psychology often highlight this period as a significant turning point. It certainly altered the public's perception, but did it also change Elvis the Man, creating or solidifying one of his two personalities? Before the Army, Elvis was the raw, rebellious, often controversial rock and roller. His manager, Colonel Parker, saw the Army as an opportunity to clean up Elvis's image, to turn him into a national hero, not just a rock and roll sensation. And for a time it worked. The Elvis, with his military haircut and uniform, became a symbol of patriotism and respect. This rebranding was heavily promoted in the media, as documented by cultural studies on celebrity and military service. The public saw him as a regular guy serving his country, just like millions of other young men. This was a deliberate construction of a good boy persona distinct from the bad boy image of his early career. But the personal impact on Elvis was more complex. Psychologically, military service, especially in a structured environment like the Army, demands conformity and discipline. For someone who had enjoyed unprecedented freedom and adoration since becoming famous, this was a stark contrast. Biographers, including Elaine Dundee in her work on Elvis, note that while he outwardly embraced his service, finding camaraderie with his fellow soldiers and demonstrating a capacity for loyalty, he also experienced significant personal loss during this time. His mother Gladys died in August 1958 while he was stationed in Germany. This event, perhaps the most devastating of his life, threw him into deep grief and depression. Some academic analyses of trauma and identity suggest that such a profound loss, occurring during a period of forced conformity and separation from his usual support system, could have had a lasting impact on his psychological makeup. It might have solidified a more melancholic, inward-looking side of his personality. The loss of Gladys, his closest confidante and emotional anchor, removed a key element that had grounded his original self. The fun-loving, innocent Elvis was now a grieving son, forced to mature rapidly under immense pressure. While in the army, Elvis also met Priscilla Beaulieu, who would later become his wife. This relationship, begun during a period of vulnerability and emotional need, further shaped his private life. The disciplined military environment, combined with personal tragedy, may have fostered a more controlled, perhaps even more guarded, aspect of his personality, contrasting sharply with his earlier uninhibited public self. He learned to be a soldier, to follow orders, but he also lost his mother. He came back a hero, but also a man carrying deep sorrow. Did the army fundamentally alter Elvis's core identity, or did it merely provide a stage for the emergence of a more disciplined, but also more vulnerable, side of him? How much of the GI Elvis was a genuine shift in personality versus a carefully constructed public image for a man dealing with profound personal loss? And, did the experiences of conformity and tragedy during his service make it harder for him to reconnect with the rebellious, untamed spirit that had defined his early success? But number 11, did Hollywood create an other Elvis? Hollywood swallowed Elvis whole in the 1960s, turning him into a cinematic commodity. But did this industry machine create an other Elvis, a separate entity from the electrifying musical artist, or merely exploit an existing facet of his personality? Academic investigations into celebrity and film, like those published in journals of media studies, often point to Hollywood's powerful influence on an artist's persona, sometimes at the cost of their artistic integrity. From 1960 to 1969, Elvis made 27 films. These were mostly lighthearted, formulaic musical comedies. Titles like G.I. Blues, Blue Hawaii, Viva Las Vegas, and Roustabout showcased a handsome, charming, singing leading man. This Hollywood Elvis was a stark contrast to the rebellious, hip-swiveling rocker who had burst onto the scene in the mid-50s. The film roles were often bland, the scripts forgettable, and the musical numbers designed for commercial appeal rather than artistic expression. Cultural critics, such as those who contributed to Rolling Stone magazine in later analyses, often argued that the films diluted Elvis's talent. They turned him into a safe, marketable product. The edge, the danger, the raw sensuality that defined his early performances were all smoothed over. This other, Elvis, was the wholesome boy next door, capable of a bit of harmless romance and a catchy tune. He was a non-threatening figure designed to appeal to a broad family audience. This was exactly what Colonel Parker wanted: maximum commercial return with minimum controversy. Scholars studying the music industry and celebrity branding have noted how this period effectively sidelined Elvis as a serious musical artist. While other musicians were experimenting with new sounds and pushing boundaries in the 60s, Elvis was stuck in a movie factory, churning out soundtracks that often felt generic. This created a profound disconnect between what the public saw on screen and what true music fans knew he was capable of. It also, many believe, created a deep frustration within Elvis himself. He reportedly hated many of his movies and felt stifled creatively. This Hollywood phase arguably created a second personality that was less authentic to Elvis's core artistic identity. It was a role he played, a persona he adopted for commercial purposes, which might have gradually eroded his sense of self. He became an actor playing Elvis rather than simply being Elvis the artist. The constant pressure to be this Hollywood Elvis meant he rarely had the chance to fully be the passionate, innovative musician he once was. The vibrant, risk-taking performer was replaced by a polished, predictable movie star. Did the demands of the Hollywood system force Elvis to inhabit a persona so removed from his true self that it fundamentally altered his perception of his own identity? Was the Hollywood Elvis a necessary commercial evil, or a tragic artistic diversion that robbed him of creative vitality? And if he truly hated these roles, how much of his later life malaise can be traced back to this prolonged period of artistic compromise and the resulting internal conflict? Number 10. What did his inner circle know about his private struggles? Elvis's inner circle, often called the Memphis Mafia, were his friends, confidantes, and employees. They lived with him, traveled with him, and were privy to the intimate details of his life. What they witness suggests a deeply complex man, often at odds with the public persona, revealing the profound two personalities, not just as public image, but as an internal reality. For academic research on celebrity life, relying heavily on biographies and memoirs from those close to him, offers crucial insights into this hidden side. These friends like Red West, Sonny West, and Joe Esposito, in their own accounts and interviews often cited in academic studies of celebrity support systems, paint a picture of a man who is generous, kind, and deeply spiritual one moment, and then paranoid, demanding, and volatile the next. They saw the good Elvis, the one who would give away Cadillacs on a whim, who cared deeply for his family and friends, who could engage in profound discussions about God and philosophy for hours. This was the vulnerable Elvis, the one who sought connection and meaning. But they also saw the other Elvis. The insulated, increasingly isolated figure at Graceland, surrounded by people but often alone. They witnessed his struggles with prescription drugs, which intensified significantly in the late 1960s and 1970s. These drug dependencies, as detailed in numerous scholarly investigations into addiction and its impact on behavior, profoundly affected his mood, judgment, and personality. He would swing from euphoria to deep depression, from gentle kindness to sudden, irrational anger. Dr. Nick G. Tinoremas, a medical historian who has examined the health records and personal accounts surrounding Elvis's later life, points out that the chronic pain from various ailments, combined with the heavy medication, created a physical and psychological feedback loop. This exacerbated his mood swings and made him unpredictable. The Memphis Mafia bore witness to the physical decline and the emotional unraveling that was carefully hidden from the public. They saw the demanding superstar who would test their loyalty, sometimes with bizarre requests or sudden outbursts. They knew about his intense loneliness despite being constantly surrounded. They saw his search for meaning in various spiritual teachings, gurus, and books, an almost desperate attempt to find answers to questions that fame couldn't solve. This private Elvis was often insecure, prone to self-doubt, and deeply affected by criticism. The vibrant, confident performer on stage was often a character he adopted, while the man behind the scenes was fragile and struggling. Their testimonies, whether in books like Elvis, What Happened, or in documentaries, provide some of the most raw and unfiltered glimpses into the chasm between the public idol and the tormented individual. If his closest friends saw such stark contradictions, how much of Elvis's true self was ever truly integrated, even in his private life? Did the constant need to present a flawless public image contribute to the amplification of these private struggles and the deepening of his internal split? And what was the true cost, to both Elvis and those around him, of maintaining such a carefully guarded and increasingly divergent dual existence? Number 9. How did Priscilla see two different men? Priscilla Presley, as his wife and partner during a significant period of his life, offers one of the most intimate perspectives on Elvis's two personalities. Her memoir, Elvis and Me, and subsequent interviews have been vital sources for academic investigations into Elvis's personal life, marriage, and the psychological impact of fame on relationships. Her accounts consistently describe a man of profound contradictions, almost as if she lived with two distinct individuals. Priscilla first met Elvis when she was just 14 while he was serving in the army in Germany. She describes him then as a charismatic, tender, and deeply vulnerable man. This was the Elvis who shared his insecurities, his dreams, and his spiritual quest. He was sensitive, romantic, and sought a deep connection. This was the private Elvis who revealed his emotional fragility and his need for love and understanding. She saw his deep respect for his mother's memory and his genuine warmth. Academic studies of early relationships under celebrity stress note that such bonds formed in moments of vulnerability can create a powerful, albeit often complicated, intimacy. But as their relationship matured and they moved to Graceland, Priscilla also encountered the other Elvis. This was the demanding superstar, the one accustomed to having his every whim catered to. He controlled her appearance, her life, and had clear expectations about her role as his wife. This was the Elvis who, according to Priscilla, could be jealous, possessive, and emotionally distant. She witnessed his increasing reliance on prescription drugs, which, as scholars in addiction studies point out, often leads to dramatic shifts in personality, mood, and behavior. He would become volatile, withdrawn, and prone to irrational outbursts. Priscilla often speaks of his struggle between the spiritual and the material, the humble man from Tupelo and the king of rock and roll. She saw him grappling with the burden of his fame, trying to reconcile the simple man he felt he was inside with the mythological figure the world expected him to be. In her accounts, the generous, loving husband would sometimes disappear, replaced by a dark, brooding, and self-destructive individual consumed by his inner demons. This emotional seesaw was a constant in their marriage. The marriage itself became a site where these two personalities clashed. The tender romantic could also be the one who struggled with fidelity, who prioritized his public image and lavish lifestyle. Priscilla's narrative highlights the immense pressure of living with an icon, where the lines between the man and the myth blurred, and the private person was constantly battling the public persona. Her story is a poignant testament to the reality of those two distinct Elvises existing within one man, making life for those closest to him both magical and incredibly challenging. Did Priscilla's relationship with Elvis inadvertently reinforce his two personalities by adapting to each one, or was she simply trying to navigate an impossible situation? Could a more integrated singular Elvis have sustained such an intense and demanding relationship, or was the duality an inherent part of who he was in love? And how much of her own identity became intertwined with these two distinct aspects of Elvis, making it difficult for her to separate the man from the legend even after their divorce? Number 8 was the jumpsuit Elvis a character or a true reflection?
The jumpsuit Elvis of the Las Vegas and concert touring years late 1960s to mid 1970s is one of the most enduring images of his career.
But was this flamboyant, larger-than-life figure a character Elvis adopted for the stage, or was it a true reflection of a developed, albeit altered, personality? Academic investigations into performance, celebrity iconography, and the psychology of stage personas offer various interpretations. When Elvis returned to live performances with the '68 comeback special, he briefly revisited his rebellious leather-clad image. But almost immediately after, he launched into his Las Vegas residency where the signature jumpsuits became his uniform. These suits, adorned with rhinestones, capes, and intricate designs, were theatrical. They were designed for spectacle, for a grand, almost operatic presentation of a living legend. This was Elvis the King, regal and commanding. Cultural theorists studying celebrity image often analyze the jumpsuit as a deliberate symbol of monarchy, a costume for the king of rock and roll to inhabit his throne. Some scholars argue that the jumpsuit Elvis was indeed a character. It allowed him to project an invincible, almost superhuman image, a performer who was above the fray. This persona was about power, control, and delivering a spectacular show. It offered him a shield, a way to be the king the audience expected, even as his personal life spiraled. Performance studies often discuss how artists create personas to manage the demands of fame, and the jumpsuit could be seen as a physical manifestation of that constructed self. It was a way to maintain the illusion of strength and magnetism, even as his physical and mental health deteriorated. However, other academic perspectives suggest that this persona, while theatrical, was also a reflection of his own evolving desires and struggles. The extravagance of the jumpsuits, the dramatic flair, the grand gestures on stage could be seen as an outward expression of his internal world. As his drug use intensified and his personal life became more chaotic, the stage became a refuge, a place where he could still be the king. The vulnerability he felt off stage was replaced by a kind of exaggerated confidence on stage. Dr. Suzanne Smith, a scholar of performance art, notes that for many performers, the stage persona can become a means of coping, a place where self-mythologizing becomes a form of self-preservation. The jumpsuit Elvis also showcased his versatility. He wasn't just singing rock and roll, he was performing ballads, gospel, and pop songs, showcasing his vocal range and emotional depth, even as his physical movements became more constrained. While the outfits were a costume, the voice and the passion, however diminished at times, were still fundamentally Elvis. The duality here is that the costume was a character, but the man inside was still very much present, projecting his feelings through the artifice. Did the jumpsuit Elvis give him a necessary psychological escape from his own worsening personal struggles, or did it trap him further within an unsustainable persona? Was the theatricality of the jumpsuits a sign of artistic growth into a mature showman, or a symptom of a deeper disconnect between his true self and his public role? And in those final, often difficult performances, Was the man beneath the sequins still truly connected to the myth he was portraying? Number 7. Did drugs widen the gulf between his selves? The tragic role of prescription drug abuse in Elvis Presley's later life is a well-documented aspect of his story, and academic investigations into addiction, celebrity, and mental health consistently identify it as a major factor in widening the gulf between his public and private selves, creating an even more pronounced two personalities. Elvis's drug use began innocuously enough, often for pain relief, or to manage insomnia and anxiety, issues common to performers under immense pressure. But it escalated, particularly in the late 1960s and 1970s. Biographers like Alana Nash, who delves into the medical records and testimonies, reveal a man who became increasingly reliant on a cocktail of sedatives, stimulants, and painkillers. These substances, as clinical psychological studies on addiction show, profoundly alter brain chemistry, affecting mood, judgment, perception, and personality. The public often saw the jumpsuit Elvis, the charismatic, powerful performer who could still deliver an iconic show. This was the facade, often maintained with stimulants and sheer force of will, even when the underlying reality was dire. Cultural analyses of celebrity decline often highlight how performers can put on a brave face, presenting a vibrant persona even as they are crumbling internally. This public self, while still capable of moments of brilliance, became increasingly disconnected from the private reality. Behind closed doors at Graceland, the story was different. The drugs created a private Elvis who was often erratic, paranoid, moody, and isolated. His inner circle witnessed his unpredictable behavior, sudden bursts of anger, prolonged periods of depression, irrational decisions, and an increasing detachment from reality. He would become reclusive, spending days in bed, surrounded by an entourage but profoundly alone. This was the other Elvis, ravaged by addiction, consumed by physical and psychological pain, and losing a battle for self-control. In academic papers on the toxicology of Elvis's death, which revealed high levels of various prescription drugs, confirmed the extent of his dependency. The long-term use of such substances, as addiction medicine specialists explain, can lead to a phenomenon known as splitting, where an individual's personality fragments, making it difficult to maintain a consistent sense of self. The core, loving, spiritual Elvis was still there, but it was often buried under layers of drug-induced confusion, anger, and despair. The drugs didn't just mask his problems, they created new ones, amplifying any existing internal conflict and solidifying the divide between the man he was and the man he became under their influence. The once vibrant, intuitive self was increasingly replaced by a drugged, impaired version, creating a tragic, pronounced duality. Could Elvis have ever truly reconciled his two personalities without confronting his drug addiction head-on, or did the substances merely provide a temporary, destructive bridge between them? How much of the paranoid or erratic Elvis was a consequence of the drugs, and how much was an amplification of pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities? And to what extent did the constant pressure of living up to the king persona contribute to his reliance on drugs as a means of escape or performance enhancement? Number 6. What psychological theories explain his duality? Elvis Presley's apparent two personalities have fascinated psychologists and cultural theorists, leading to various academic investigations attempting to explain this duality through established psychological frameworks. These theories offer ways to understand how a single individual can embody such profound contradictions. One prevalent theory is the concept of a persona, as defined by Carl Jung. Jung suggested that the persona is a mask or a public face that individuals adopt to present themselves to the world, often to conform to societal expectations or the demands of their profession. For Elvis, the rebellious rocker, the patriotic GI, the charming movie star, and the flamboyant Vegas showman could all be seen as different personas. The real Elvis, the quiet, spiritual, insecure man, would then be the underlying self that existed beneath these masks. Academic papers applying Jungian psychology to celebrity often argue that the greater the discrepancy between the persona and the true self, the greater the internal conflict and potential for psychological distress. Another framework is identity theory within social psychology. This theory suggests that individuals have multiple identities, e.g., self as son, self as performer, self as husband. In Elvis's case, the overwhelming demands of his uber-performer identity might have overshadowed and even suppressed his private identities. Scholars in identity studies often explore how extreme fame can lead to a kind of identity diffusion, where the lines between these roles become blurred, making it difficult to maintain a coherent sense of self. He was always Elvis Presley, but which Elvis? The concept of self-presentation is also relevant. Irving Goffman's work on the presentation of self in everyday life suggests that individuals constantly manage impressions, performing different roles depending on the social context. Elvis, as a performer, was constantly engaged in high-stakes self-presentation. On stage, he was the king. Off stage, he might be the humble friend. The psychological toll of maintaining these distinct presentations could contribute to a feeling of being fractured or having multiple selves. The research in the psychology of performing artists often highlights the exhaustion and identity strain associated with this constant performance. Finally, some analyses might touch on aspects of dissociation, particularly in the context of his later drug use. While not necessarily a full-blown dissociative disorder, chronic stress, trauma, like his mother's death, and substance abuse can lead to feelings of detachment from one's own body, emotions, or even identity. This could manifest as a feeling of two separate selves, one observing the other, or one taking over when the other is overwhelmed. Academic studies on the psychological effects of extreme fame and addiction often explore these profound disconnections. These theories don't necessarily pathologize Elvis, but rather provide tools to understand the immense psychological pressures he faced and how he might have coped with them, often by compartmentalizing or developing distinct ways of being. Do these psychological theories offer a complete explanation for Elvis's duality, or do they merely scratch the surface of a unique and complex individual? Is it possible that his two personalities were not a pathology, but a highly effective, albeit ultimately unsustainable, coping mechanism for the demands of unprecedented fame? And if the real Elvis was always beneath the personas, did he ever truly know that singular self, or was it forever lost in the performance? Number 5. How do biographers portray his conflicting sides? Biographies of Elvis Presley are numerous, and many academic investigations into celebrity life and narrative construction often analyze how these biographies portray his two personalities. Major biographers, relying on extensive research, interviews, and historical records, consistently grapple with the conflicting facets of his character, offering nuanced perspectives on his duality. Peter Guralnick's two-volume biography, Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love, is often considered the definitive work. Guralnick meticulously details Elvis's early life, depicting him as a sensitive, polite, and deeply spiritual young man from a poor background, deeply attached to his mother. This is the innocent Elvis, but Guralnick also shows the ambitious, instinctive performer, the one who broke racial barriers and shocked the nation with his raw sensuality. He portrays a man driven by instinct and a profound, often restless creativity. In Careless Love, Guralnick chronicles the darker trajectory, showing the struggle with fame, the reliance on drugs, and the increasing isolation. He doesn't explicitly state two personalities, but rather shows the gradual, often tragic, fracturing of a once integrated self under the weight of external pressures and internal weaknesses. Academic reviews of Guralnick's work often praise his ability to present these complexities without resorting to simplistic judgments. Elaine Dundy's Elvis and Gladys focuses on his early life and his relationship with his mother. She emphasizes the profound bond with Gladys as the anchor for his good side, suggesting that her death left a void that contributed to his later struggles. Dundy's work, often cited in psychoanalytic cultural studies, positions Gladys as a stabilizing force and her loss as a catalyst for the emergence of a less stable, more fragmented Elvis. This narrative suggests that the two personalities became more pronounced after his greatest loss. Alana Nash, in books like Elvis and the Memphis Mafia and Baby Let's Play House, draws heavily on interviews with his inner circle. She provides a candid, often unsparing, look at the private Elvis, highlighting his generosity and kindness alongside his paranoia, volatility, and drug abuse. Nash's work, from a journalistic perspective, offers some of the clearest pictures of the dramatic mood swings and behavioral contradictions that define his two personalities in his later years. She shows the caring friend who could also be an abusive figure, driven by addiction and the pressures of his insulated world. Less sympathetic biographers sometimes emphasize the monster aspect, particularly in later years, while others lean towards a more tragic, misunderstood genius narrative. However, the most respected academic and popular biographies all converge on one point. Elvis was never a simple figure. He was a man of intense contradictions, a confluence of different desires, beliefs, and pressures that created a powerful, often heartbreaking duality. The biographers, by laying out the evidence, allow readers to see these distinct sides emerge and clash throughout his life. The biographers, despite their differing emphases, truly capture the essence of Elvis's internal struggles, Or do they simply offer interpretations based on available evidence? Is the portrayal of two personalities a literary device to make his complex life more understandable, or a genuine reflection of how he experienced himself? And as new information emerges, how might future academic biographies further refine our understanding of this profound duality? Number 4, what does his music tell us about his inner conflicts? Elvis Presley's music, across his entire career, provides a powerful and often poignant window into his inner conflicts and the idea of his two personalities. Academic investigations into musicology, lyrical analysis, and the cultural impact of his songs often highlight how his chosen material and his performance style reflected the warring elements within him. In his early years at Sun Records, his music was raw, electric, and rebellious. Songs like Mystery Train and Hound Dog showcased a young man brimming with confidence, sexual energy, and a defiant spirit. This was the rocker Elvis, challenging norms, pushing boundaries. Musicologists, such as those contributing to the Journal of American Music, often point to the fusion of country, blues, and gospel in his early sound as inherently dualistic, deeply rooted in tradition yet revolutionary in its delivery. His voice itself could switch from a smooth croon to a guttural growl, embodying different emotional states. But even then, a different side emerged, like his love for gospel music, expressed through albums like his Hand in Mine 1960 and How Great Thou Art 1967, revealed a deep spiritual longing and a sincere faith. These were not just commercial ventures, they were heartfelt expressions of his soul. In these recordings, the gospel Elvis was humble, devout, and searching for solace. The vulnerability and sincerity in his gospel singing provided a stark contrast to the often swaggering rock and roll persona. Cultural studies of religious music frequently note the profound emotional authenticity Elvis brought to these tracks. As his career progressed into the Hollywood years, his music largely became more commercial and less personally expressive. Many of his movie soundtracks were lighthearted pop songs, often generic, showcasing a clean-cut Elvis designed for mass appeal. This period, analyzed by critics and music history journals, is often seen as a compromise, where the fire of his early years was dimmed in favor of marketability. Here, the performer Elvis seemed to be doing a job, fulfilling a contract, rather than pouring his heart out. However, even in his later years, during the Vegas era, when his personal struggles were most acute, his music could still reveal profound internal conflict. Songs like Suspicious Minds and In the Ghetto showcased a more mature, often melancholic, and socially aware artist. His live performances, though sometimes physically diminished, often contained moments of raw emotional power, particularly in his delivery of ballads like American Trilogy or My Way. In these songs, he was both the grand showman and the deeply vulnerable man, reflecting on his life, his regrets, and his enduring spirit. The lyrics of My Way, in particular, have been analyzed as his personal statement, a blend of defiance and weariness, reflecting a man who lived life on his own terms but carried its heavy burden. His voice, even when strained, conveyed a lifetime of experience, showing the battle between the myth and the man. Did Elvis consciously choose music that reflected his internal duality, or did his conflicting selves simply find expression through the diverse material he performed? Could a deeper analysis of his unreleased recordings or private jam sessions reveal more nuanced aspects of his inner conflicts that were kept from the public? And did the shifts in his musical style over the decades represent genuine personal evolution, or a constant struggle to reconcile two fundamental, perhaps irreconcilable parts of his artistic soul? Number 3, did his mother's death fracture his identity? Gladys Presley's death in August 1958, while Elvis was in the army in Germany, is consistently identified by academic investigations and biographers as the single most devastating event in his life. It is often cited as a critical moment that could have fractured his identity, deepening any existing two personalities and setting him on a more troubled path. Elvis had an extraordinarily close relationship with his mother. She was his confidant, his biggest supporter, and his emotional anchor. Biographers like Elaine Dundee and Elvis and Gladys describe a bond that was almost symbiotic, a relationship so intense that some psychoanalytic interpretations have suggested it bordered on an Oedipal complex. Like Gladys provided him with a sense of security, unconditional love, and a connection to his humble roots. She was his constant. For many years, she was the one who grounded the shy, polite, Elvis, even as the wild rock and roll persona emerged. When Gladys died at the age of 46, Elvis was inconsolable. Witnesses describe his profound grief, his almost childlike wails of sorrow. He reportedly collapsed over her coffin, begging her not to leave him. This loss, occurring during a period of enforced separation and vulnerability in the army, was a catastrophic blow. The academic studies on grief and trauma, particularly in relation to parental loss, indicate that such an event can have profound and lasting psychological consequences, especially for individuals whose identity is heavily reliant on the lost parent. Dr. George E. Vaillant's work on adult development and defenses suggests that early parental loss can sometimes lead to difficulties in emotional regulation and a search for external validation. For Elvis, Gladys's death removed his primary source of emotional stability and a crucial link to his past. Without her grounding presence, the pressures of fame and the artificiality of his celebrity lifestyle may have become even more overwhelming. It's often argued that a part of the real Elvis died with her. The innocent, humble boy who was so connected to his mother may have receded, making way for a more insulated, perhaps even desperate, individual. This loss might have also contributed to his later reliance on an entourage, a Memphis mafia, to fill the void, creating an insular world where his impulses were rarely challenged. It also arguably led to a deeper search for meaning, whether through spiritual books or tragically through the escapism of drugs. The good Elvis, the one who sought purity and connection, may have struggled more intensely after this point, while the other Elvis, the one prone to excess and isolation, became more dominant as a coping mechanism. The unity he once felt, however fragile, was shattered. If Gladys had lived, could she have provided the stability needed to prevent the widening chasm between Elvis's two personalities? Was her death the point of no return for his internal conflicts, after which true integration became almost impossible? And how much of the other Elvis, the demanding, erratic, and ultimately self-destructive figure, was a manifestation of unresolved grief and the desperate search for a lost sense of self? Number 2 is the two Elvises concept of simplification. While the idea of two Elvises offers a compelling framework for understanding his life, academic investigations into his complexity also prompt a critical question: is this concept of simplification perhaps too neat, a division for a truly multifaceted individual? Many scholars argue for a more nuanced view, suggesting that he was not split into two distinct, static personalities, but rather was a dynamic individual grappling with a multitude of conflicting forces. Cultural theorists and psychologists engaging with celebrity studies often caution against overly simplistic binary explanations. They argue that attributing two personalities can sometimes reduce a rich, evolving identity to a less complex narrative. Instead, they suggest considering Elvis as an individual experiencing extreme pressures, whose personality traits were fluid and expressed differently depending on context, age, and external influences. This perspective views him not as two separate entities, but as a single person with a broad spectrum of human traits, some of which were in constant tension. For instance, the rebel and the patriot weren't necessarily two separate people. Academic papers on identity development suggest that individuals can hold contradictory beliefs and behaviors simultaneously. Elvis's patriotism was genuine, rooted in his working-class Southern upbringing, even as his music challenged societal norms. The desire for respectability and the urge for rebellion could coexist within him, rather than being exclusive personalities. He was a blend, not a break. Moreover, the humble boy and the demanding star could be seen as natural responses to his environment. The quiet, polite Elvis was likely his default setting, while the demanding star was a coping mechanism for the overwhelming demands of fame, isolation, and ultimately, addiction. Researchers in the psychology of fame often note how unchecked power and constant adulation can erode empathy and foster an inflated sense of self, but this doesn't necessarily mean a separate personality emerges. It's a behavioral adaptation, albeit a problematic one. The influence of Colonel Parker is another point. Parker didn't necessarily create a second personality in Elvis, rather, he relentlessly marketed and amplified certain facets of Elvis's existing personality, the wholesome movie star, the patriotic GI, while suppressing others, the raw artist, the intellectual seeker. This was a manipulation of image, which, while impacting Elvis internally, doesn't automatically mean a complete psychological split. Ultimately, the more nuanced view suggests that Elvis was a deeply sensitive, insecure, and artistically driven individual who struggled under the immense weight of his own myth. His contradictions were not separate people but different expressions of one complex soul battling internal conflicts and external pressures. The drug use, the isolation, and the unfulfilled artistic potential didn't create a second personality as much as they distorted and fragmented the original one, making it appear as if two distinct individuals were warring within him. If Elvis truly wasn't two distinct personalities, what more accurate psychological or sociological frameworks could better explain his profound contradictions? Does the Two Elvises narrative, despite its compelling simplicity, detract from a deeper understanding of the human cost of unprecedented fame and artistic compromise? And if we move beyond the binary, what richer insights can we gain into the struggles of an icon grappling with the true self versus the manufactured myth? Number one, what does the end reveal about the beginning? Elvis Presley's final years and his untimely death in 1977 offer a tragic yet deeply illuminating look back at the beginning of his life and the enduring question of his two personalities. Academic investigations into his decline, drawing on medical records, personal accounts, and cultural analyses of his legacy, often see his end as a culmination of the conflicts that had plagued him for decades, revealing how the beginning shaped the end. In his final tours, the jumpsuit Elvis was still on stage, performing for adoring crowds, often still capable of moments of brilliance. But behind the sequins, the private Elvis was struggling immensely. His health had deteriorated significantly, ravaged by years of prescription drug abuse and a diet that lacked nutritional balance. He was bloated, often disoriented, and experiencing severe pain from various ailments. Medical historians reviewing the circumstances of his death point to a complex interplay of drug toxicity, heart disease, and digestive issues. This physical decline mirrored his internal state, showing the extreme toll his lifestyle had taken. The isolated existence at Graceland, which intensified in his later years, harks back to the shy, introverted side of his early youth. The boy who loved to spend time alone, dreaming, became a man isolated by fame, surrounded by an entourage, but profoundly lonely. This reclusiveness, as explored in studies of celebrity pathology, suggests a retreat from a world he found increasingly overwhelming and difficult to navigate without the support of substances. The public face was still charismatic, but the private man was trapped and struggling. His spiritual quest, a constant thread from his gospel-singing youth, also intensified in his final years. He delved into various religions, philosophies, and self-help books, desperately seeking answers and inner peace. This was the deeply introspective, searching Elvis trying to reconcile the spiritual man with the secular king he had become. This search for meaning, often frantic, reveals a yearning for the purity and simplicity he may have felt in his early days, a profound internal conflict between his worldly success and his spiritual needs. The academic analyses of his spiritual journey often conclude that he was searching for a way to bridge the gap between his two disparate lives. Ultimately, his death at the age of 42 was a tragic endpoint to a life lived under an almost unbearable magnifying glass. It laid bare the destructive consequences of the long-standing conflict between the public myth and the private reality. The rebellious fire of his youth, the innocent charm, the boundless energy all were consumed by the demands of fame, the compromises of his career, and the devastating impact of addiction. The two personalities did not simply coexist, they waged a war within him, and in the end, both were lost. His final moments reveal a man who was desperately trying to hold himself together, a stark contrast to the confident, world-changing figure he once was. The end, then, underscores that the duality was not just an image, but a deep-seated, ultimately fatal, struggle for his soul. Could anything have truly saved Elvis from the self-destructive path that defined his final years, or was his end a tragic inevitability given the profound duality of his life? Does his death offer a definitive answer to whether his two personalities were distinct entities or a single, fractured self? And what enduring lessons does his life and death offer about the pressures of celebrity, the nature of identity, and the relentless battle between the self we project and the self we truly are?